Hello and welcome to Missio Talk. My name is Mark Chamberlain and this is a forum to discuss issues of mission and ministry in the Diocese of Christchurch. Its purpose is to resource clergy and parishes and to help us all develop and strengthen the ways we participate in God's mission to the world. My guest today is Carolyn Robertson, and her topic has to do with preaching, especially preaching in today's culture. Welcome, Carolyn.
Thanks, good to be here.
Preaching. A lot of people think it's a bit of a dying art, you know, sitting, listening to a monologue for 20 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that a lot now. Sermons are boring, no one wants to listen to a sermon. I think actually if you look at the wider culture, the opposite is true. People are listening to podcasts all the time now.
Yeah.
TED Talks are taking off. People are happy to go and listen all day to people talking for 20 minutes, one after another. What I think is happening is people's tolerance for bad sermons have disappeared.
Right.
And so I think there's a real interest, and I think an increasing interest in good oratory.
This is a really important topic, in other words, today, because, you know, our clergy are preaching sermons every week. How can we do it better? How can we improve our oratory? So let's drill down on some of those things. Tell me about the content of your preaching. What are you talking about? Where do you get your content from?
So I am a passionate preacher on the Gospels, because I think the Christian faith, you know, pivots on the person of Jesus. And I think for people who are not used to going to church, that's what they're curious about. Who is Jesus? What relevance does this have for me? There's a framework that I use, and it's what, so what, now what, which is called Rolf's reflective practice. And I think it works really well in a sermon. The what's happening in this passage, what's going on, then so what? Why was this significant in Jesus' time? Why is it significant in the era that it happened? And then now what? Why is this significant in my life today? What do I need to change? What can I challenge? How do I grow from this space? So those what, now what, so what? And I think you can usually get a story that's a really good illustration for each of those. The what, the story is the gospel, that's the story. The so what, you know, what was happening in the climate of the day, what was happening in that culture, are there some, you know, added stories you can tell around that? And now what, is there a person that exemplifies this wrestling with this issue and changing something in their own lives? And I think a negative story can also work there, like I can tell a story. This is something I struggle with myself. This is something I'm wrestling with. This is something I find difficult. You know, if you're talking about forgiveness, that's a good one to be able to say, this is hard. This is really hard to do this. This is how I struggle. But here's where, you know, I have wrestled and found a moment where I've been able to do that. So the what, so what, now what is the content.
There are preachers out there putting a lot of work into their sermons each week. Getting resources from various places. Where do you get your resources from?
I have found this fabulous website, and to me it's my go-to every single week. And so every Tuesday morning I will read the gospel passage. That's my first day of work for the week. I read it, and then there's this website from an organisation called Sojourners in the States, and their website is sojo.net, and they have, for the lectionary readings every week, about 12 or 13 different takes on it, and they're not long. Some of them are just a few paragraphs. Some of them are extended, and they're from some of the best theologians in the world. Like my favourite theologian is Walter Brueggemann. He's often featured, but there's a real range too. There's Protestant, Catholic, men, women, heaps of different ethnic groups, and a variety of theological positions. So I find that really good. I don't always agree with a position, but it always makes me think.
Sure.
And so then I will mull on that. So I'll read that first thing Tuesday morning, then go about my week. And as I'm driving, as you know, I'm just doing something boring, I'm sort of in the back of my mind going over what I've read. And so by the time I actually come to pull it all together, I'll usually have a good story from there and a good angle and something fresh, a fresh take. So often the now what is really good. And there's really good sort of explanations on why it was relevant and important in Jesus' day. So for me, that's been my go-to every week, and it's a fabulous resource, and it has saved me an awful lot of time.
How much does it cost?
I use my book allowance for it. It's Might be $150 a year.
Okay.
But to me, $3 a week is incredible value.
It's often that interesting angle or thought-provoking, relevant angle that we're all looking for. It sounds like sojo.com.
.net.
.net, is a good place to go.
For me, it's been incredible.
Yeah.
I'm looking for efficiency. You don't have heaps of time in your day. Yeah.
So a few comments on preaching style. There's such a broad range out there. What are your thoughts?
There's a guy called Paul Windsor, and he is the International Program Director for Langham Preaching, and his specialty is figuring out how to preach the gospel in different contexts. He's from New Zealand, and he has this little explanation of what he thinks works very well for Joe Average New Zealander. I think a lot of sermons actually, to me, are quite reminiscent of an academic conference where someone will get up and read a paper. And that's great if your average, IQ or everyone's IQ in the room is extremely high, but that's not always the case. And so, to reach a broader range and to have a service that's going to reach people outside of that niche group, he has 5 points which he calls Lucas, Lucis, and the first one is laid back, understated, conversational, informal, and self-deprecating.
Right.
And that is how New Zealanders talk, and that's how they present. And if you sort of go back over each of those points, you can see it in our politicians, you can see it in our own celebrities, famous people who do well, very understated, self-deprecating. New Zealanders are a lot less formal than other cultures. And so to reach a broad range of the New Zealand cross-section, to pick up on this style of preaching is really helpful. What I think is also worth noting, he's got laid back, understated, our Liu. He's not, to do this, it's not lazy and underprepared, because I think a lot of people think that when you're being casual or less formal, that it's coming across like you don't know what you're talking about. Sometimes I think it's harder work. I've read that Martin Luther King used to write his sermons and then almost memorise them. And so it looked like he was speaking off the cuff, and he wasn't. He knew the material inside and out. And so there's that need to do that. It's kind of easier to get up and read, but to actually know your material so well that you can be engaging and conversational in the way you present.
Yeah, I get that.
There's another interesting thing in the English language. We have, two main streams that flow into English, and that's Latin based words and then Anglo-Saxon words. And Latin are very formal and long, and that's what you'll use in writing. And Anglo-Saxon are short, and that's where we get our 4-letter words all from. And that's how we talk. And so when you write something and then read it, you can tell, because the way we have been taught to write is very Latin based. But the way we talk in everyday life is Anglo-Saxon. And so you've got to make this conscious effort to sound conversational, to write as if you're speaking it.
So, Carolyn, are there other resources that you sort of marshal and use in your preaching?
I'm a very visual person, and so I do use PowerPoint. I don't use it heavily. I will use it to put a fabulous quote up so people will remember that quote. But I also find artworks, because there's such a beautiful volume of Christian paintings of almost every biblical story ever. And so I actually find that helpful in my preparation too, where I will go and as I'm looking at different people's take on the story, then I'll find artworks. And that often does take me quite a while. But then that actually helps me when I'm preaching. It's a cue for me, because when I look at my PowerPoint notes, I see the picture and I know what I'm going to talk about. So it's a cue for me, and people will always look up when they see a picture. When they notice out of their peripheral vision that the slides change, they'll all look up. We've just done an all-age service. Whenever we put a picture up, the kids all looked up and watched the picture.
That's helpful. Final question. Can you give some examples of great preaching? I mean, I myself love listening to a good preacher and thinking, wow, I could learn this or that from that from that preacher?
Actually, where I go to get my examples of great speaking is sort of not preaching. I think on Netflix at the moment, there's a Netflix special by the thinker Brené Brown, and she does, I think, just an hour stand-up talking. And the way she talks, the stories she tells about herself, her presentation style, I think, is a perfect example of a way of speaking that resonates with people. Mm-hmm. Then the other place I go to get hot tips is stand-up comics. And Netflix has heaps of stand-up comics. Even their mic technique, I've been told by our sound guys, for a younger generation, use a handheld. So I will use a handheld in our service that's targeting people who are not used to going to church. Okay. So even little things like that, I watch, it's like, and mimic, and timing. And I think one of the key things for me that I'm really trying to pick up on is authenticity. And when you look and you watch these people, they come across as really authentic. The stories and jokes they tell are at their own expense. They haven't, read a twee story that could get a couple of laughs that they introduce their talk with. They're just straight in there talking about themselves with real life stories. And I think that's one of the things I've learned. And I think that's quite different from how you get taught to preach. Often you get told, do a funny little story at the beginning that may or may not be related, get people relaxed, then in you go. Whereas when you watch these speakers, it's quite a different style. And I found that really helpful. So getting my tips from non-preachers for preaching.
That's great advice. Another final question. What's the link in your mind between a regenerating church, a regenerating diocese, and great preaching?
In my experience, great preaching does actually attract people. And I think because people have really played down the importance of sermons, and people, say, that's not going to make any difference, that, we've forgotten that. And all through history, you can see that people have worked on their craft of preaching, have been able to pull a crowd. And it's not, I think, about the person, it's the message. And if you can, find a way to present this message in an engaging way, the message speaks for itself. And people are curious about spiritual things. People want to know who Jesus was. People want to know how their lives can be different. So to me, I think good preaching will grow a church.
I'm certain you're right. Thank you so much, Carolyn, for coming and talking about preaching in a contemporary world. And there's been lots of hints and things that we've been able to learn. I'm sure everyone has really been encouraged by what you've had to say. Thank you.